One of us isn't me. Is it you?
asked Ninky.
Well, I'm not you, if that helps,
Nurdle replied,
Right. So it's you that isn't me.
chuckled Ninky to his friend.
I don't think either of us are quite who we were after what happened yesterday in Cornwall.
Nurdle answered. George, the young boy that lived in the big house, enjoyed 3 things. One was visiting his grandad, another was playing with paint, the third was digging holes. Grandad lived in an old farmhouse beside wild and overgrown pasture land. Like all other humans, hereabouts and thereabouts, he was quite unaware of those living beneath the soil so close by. Which is the way the Noodles of Noodle-Land liked it. George put aside his paint box and paintbrush.
That's excellent,
Exclaimed Grandad, as he admired the birthday card that George had smothered in splotches of blue, red and yellow-coloured water.
Your father will be really proud of you.
He added,
Why not go out and play in the pasture?
and he pointed from the window to tufts of grassy green only a few yards from the back door. George wasted no time. He sprang to his feet and shouted, "Dig! Dig!" which was the signal for Grandad to take him to the garden tool shed. On a hook labelled George hung a small trowel.
This time next year you'll be able to reach it yourself,
Grandad remarked as he handed it down to George. But George wasn't listening. He was already racing towards the gap in the hedge that opened onto the pasture, and he only tripped up once. Within no time at all, at least within very little time, George had begun scratching and scraping at the rough grass until he had cleared away a tuft or two to reveal a small patch of bare soil. The soil was soft, and within no time at all, at least within very little time, George had scooped out a hole several inches deep. Ninky asked,
How is the new tunnel coming along?
to which Nurdle replied, "Well, I don't want to appear difficult, but it's more a case of how is it going along."
Huh?
Ninky said, "It's not coming along towards me, it's going along away from me,"
Whatever.
retorted Ninky. The hole grew deeper as George enthusiastically heaped more soil onto his little trowel and scattered it around him. "Well," continued Nurdle, "it will be a secret escape route for us should the need ever arise."
I think you should have asked permission from the leader first. He deals with planning permission in Noodle-Land.
"He might have said no," said Nurdle.
He would have said no,
retorted Ninky. George let out a squeal of delight. He had been about to stop digging, but decided to plunge his trowel into the ground just one more time. He held the trowel tightly and bent his fingers into a fist. He lifted the trowel above his head. He waited for 3 seconds, let out a loud "Woo!" and stabbed it fiercely into the hole. This was a moment that made him squeal with delight. The ground seemed to shake. A shower of loose earth and clumps of grass fell onto Nurdle's head. "What the? Ninky, come here quickly!" he yelled. Ninky raced along the new tunnel. As he approached Nurdle, he tried very hard not to laugh.
Oh dear,
He said,
what a mess. What have you done?
Nurdle glowered at him, and then raised a hairy arm and sharpened claw towards the roof of the tunnel.
What is it?
Ninky asked with a glitter in his eyes. He had decided to wear bright orange eyes that day. Nurdle gritted his pointed green teeth, looked up and screeched, "It's a hole where a hole shouldn't be. I can see the sky." George could not remember when he was ever more excited. "Low!" he shouted down the hole, hoping that he might hear a "low" back. There was silence, because Ninky and Nurdle were silent. They were silent because they were flabbergasted. They were flabbergasted because normally their only contact with humans was on a special HSD. That is, a human scare day.
I recognise that voice,
whispered Ninky. It belongs to that boy, added Nurdle.
the one we frightened in Cornwall,
chuckled Ninky. I remember it well, said Nurdle. We scratched at the window of the car he was travelling in,
with our faces decorated in bright colours and our teeth painted green.
before adding,
But shush, I have an idea.
George peered down into the hole again. "Hello!" he shouted.
Hello.
Echoed an eerie voice as it made its way to the surface. Now George was really, really excited. "Hello!" he repeated.
Hello.
Repeated the voice. After a moment's hesitation, the voice hissed and spat out the words,
We're coming to get you.
George didn't understand the language of Noodles, and Noodles could make no sense of the language spoken by humans. Between them, neither knew what the other was saying.
My name, George.
said George, because that was who he was.
What did he say?
asked Ninky. He said he wasn't frightened of us, Nurdle replied.
Are you sure?
queried Ninky. No, not at all sure, Nurdle replied, but let's just pretend that's what he did say, and a broad smile spread across the faces of the two Noodles. The next 7.5 minutes passed quickly, so in just 7.25 minutes, Ninky and Nurdle had completed painting their faces and ears and noses in bright colours. They both fixed scratchy things to the end of their fingers and coloured their teeth green.
Ready?
Ninky called out. Ready, Nurdle replied.
Steady.
Growled Ninky. Go! They both roared. George peered down into the hole yet again. It was very dark where the daylight could not reach, so he positioned his face as close to the opening as he could and screwed up his eyes. Time to turn on the lights, whooped Ninky. Let the show begin, yelled Nurdle, and they both switched on their head torches, which is when George screamed. Yeah! howled Ninky as he lowered his legs and then sprang up as though he was on springs. His green teeth glittered in the gloom and his eyes flashed fiercely. He lifted a clawed finger and tapped George gently on his nose before disappearing back down the hole, which is when George screamed again. Whoa! wailed Nurdle in a ghost-like voice as Ninky landed beside him. My turn. Whoa! Dug his finger claws into the earth and clambered up the hole as quickly as he could. When he reached the top, Nurdle extended his hairy arm and tweaked George's ear before he too disappeared back down the hole. The third scream from George was so loud that frightened rabbits retreated down burrows and birds rose up into trees. Even the tufty grass seemed to tremble.
What do you reckon?
Asked Ninky. You frighten me, chuckled Nurdle. I can't imagine how that young lad feels. There was a moment or two's silence.
We can't have anyone finding that hole, or they'll discover our secret tunnel.
Said Ninky in a thoughtful voice.
And if they discover our secret tunnel, they will also discover our secret escape route. And then it will no longer be a secret.
Nurdle added. George ran back to the farmhouse at the same speed as his legs. He was exhausted by the time he reached the front door and was relieved to find it slightly ajar.
Grandad, Grandad,
he shouted. His grandfather looked up from his newspaper.
Calm down, lad,
He said, patting his hand on the sofa.
come and sit next to me. Tell me what's happened.
It tapped me on my nose and pulled my ear, cried George.
Who tapped you on the nose?
Asked Grandad. The first one, said George.
And who pulled your ear?
The other one, George replied.
The other what?
The other monster. There were several moments of very quiet silence.
Yes, indeed,
Said Grandad at last. He frowned. A puzzled look floated across his eyes.
this is very strange.
He muttered to himself. Turning back to George, he said,
Your mother told me that you both saw a grotesque creature when you were on holiday in Cornwall.
yes, yes,
said George excitedly.
When you were in the car travelling down to Penzance.
yes, yes.
George cried out.
But I still don't believe a word of it.
Grandad said. Another few moments of silence followed before George announced in a defiant voice, I will show you. Ninky had climbed out of George's newly dug hole and gone for a stroll in order to stretch his hairy legs. When he returned, he saw Nurdle standing beside the hole with George's trowel in his hand. He had been busy filling it in. One more trowel of earth should do the trick, panted Nurdle.
Of course, then you'll have to perform another trick.
Ninky remarked. Oh, and what trick is that? Inquired Nurdle.
Can you see that hole that you've just filled in?
Asked Ninky. No, of course not, exclaimed Nurdle. How can I see it when it's no longer there?
Exactly.
Exclaimed Ninky.
So how are we going to get back down?
I didn't think of that, said Nurdle, scratching his head with a finger claw. Ninky whacked him with the trowel. George tugged at his granddad's sleeve as he led him through the gap in the hedge and into the field. It's over here, he shouted, followed quickly by, Oh,
Well now,
said Grandad.
where exactly is this hole? The one where monsters jump up and tap you on the nose?
It was here, cried George, desperately pointing toward the mound of rough grass and earth. It was here, he said in an even more desperate voice as he spotted the doubtful expression on Grandad's face.
Well, it doesn't appear to be here now, he said, although what I have found is this.
And he stooped to pick up a small trowel. That proves it, exclaimed George delightedly.
It certainly suggests that you were here,
Grandad admitted, before adding quickly,
but that hole you say you dug, that's a bit of a mystery, eh, lad?
George looked crestfallen.
I reckon somebody's been playing games with you.
What sort of games, Grandad? George asked.
Filling in the holes when you weren't looking games.
Down below, in Noodle-Land, there was turmoil. Ninky and Nurdle had gone missing.
I wouldn't put it past them to build a secret tunnel,
said the leader.
Without permission,
said assistant leader.
I wouldn't put anything past young Nurdle,
sighed the leader.
Perhaps they went out through the gate to the paint and disgusting clothes store,
suggested assistant leader.
True, but they don't have a key to that door, said the leader.
Assistant leader snorted.
I have it on good authority that Nurdle can pick locks with his claws.
The leader and assistant leader looked at each other for several moments before nodding to each other.
Right, let's go get 'em.
Ninky had remembered hearing of a very secret, very well hidden underground passage in Noodle-Land. He had found it. He and Nurdle had then gone in search of its very secret, very well hidden entrance. They had found it. Its door lay towards the bottom of a ditch. To reach it, they had scrambled between thorny bushes and splashed with glee through muddy water. Noodles love getting wet.
The door doesn't open,
said Ninky as he pulled on a small handle. There is a reason for that, Nurdle retorted, and that reason is it's locked.
I need to pick this lock,
remarked Ninky. If you could pick locks, then you'd be as clever as me, said Nurdle. He stretched out a hairy hand, wriggled a finger claw into the keyhole and jiggled it right. After a lot of muttering, but not even a little success, Nurdle gave up.
If you knew how to pick this particular lock,
smiled Ninky,
then you'd be as clever as me.
What do you mean? asked Nurdle crossly.
I happen to know that this is a Noodle Mark II riddle lock,
replied Ninky.
The Noodle Mark II riddle lock engineer showed me how it worked when he fitted it last spring.
Nurdle stared at his friend and pretended not to be stunned. Meaning? he asked.
Meaning the lock turns to the left and not to the right.
The leader and assistant leader stood the other side of the door and eyed each other gleefully.
We'll just wait,
grinned the leader.
And look very cross,
added assistant leader.
And when he finally picks the Noodle Mark II riddle lock,
smiled the leader,
they'll find us waiting for them, dressed as spooky ghosts.
Nurdle fiddled about inside the Noodle Mark II riddle lock with his finger claw. He moved his finger up, down and around until, with a sharp twist to the left, the door sprang open.
Whoa! Do come in!
Ninky leapt up in terror, banged his head on the top of the door frame and fell to the floor. Nurdle leapt even higher, but then tripped over Ninky as he landed.
Who are you?
Ninky asked as he rubbed his head and gazed up in terror.
We are the ghosts of Noodle-Land.
What do you want from us? Nurdle asked in a thin, wavering voice.
We want to know what you've been up to.
Without asking permission,
roared the leader, throwing aside his white cloak.
Have you been building a secret tunnel?
Assistant leader eyed them suspiciously. It isn't really a secret tunnel, stammered Nurdle.
We were simply exploring before requesting permission to consider letting us build an emergency exit.
explained Ninky.
We?
Asked the leader.
Well, Nurdle, actually.
Said Ninky, looking up innocently at the roof of the tunnel.
I was an innocent bystander.
Gee, thanks, spluttered Nurdle. Permission to remove my terrifying and scary green skin coat, sir? Asked Assistant Leader.
Yes, yes.
Said the leader impatiently.
As for you two,
He continued, turning towards Ninky and Nurdle.
I will speak to you later, at some length.
George was very, very puzzled when he went to bed that night. He knew that he had dug a hole with his trowel. He knew what he had seen. He knew what he had felt. He felt certain that he would lie awake all night. He felt certain that he would have nightmares. He felt certain he would have horrible dreams. He felt all of these things as his eyes closed, and he fell into a deep and peaceful sleep.
Well, I believe him.
Exclaimed George's mother next morning. You do? Said his father in amazement.
Of course I do. Remember, I saw one at the car window when we travelled to Cornwall.
What you saw were raindrops.
Really? Raindrops with green eyes and yellow teeth and hands with claws for fingers?
Dad smiled. You always take his side, he said in a kindly tone.
You and Grandad are two of a kind.
Grumbled Mum as she went into the kitchen to prepare breakfast. From upstairs came the sounds of George struggling out of his cosy bed and struggling to find a bedroom door handle through bleary eyes. Dad had a grin on his face. The grin turned to horror when a thought suddenly struck him. How on earth will he cope with Halloween? stunned.
Meaning?